For months, the January 6th committee went back and forth on the issue of referring charges against former President Donald Trump to the Justice Department for prosecution. And yesterday, the committee moved definitively. It referred Trump to the DOJ on at least 4 charges: obstructing an official proceeding, defrauding the United States, making false statements, and assisting or aiding in insurrection. Joining me on the morning show, News4JAX political analyst and head of the Jacksonville University Public Policy Institute, Rick Mullaney. Good morning, Rick.
Good morning, Bruce.
So what's clear here is the DOJ is not compelled to act on any recommendations. Its own investigations would have to resolve the question of whether professional prosecutors agreed with the conclusions of Congress acting in the role of constitutional oversight.
That's true, Bruce. The recommendation itself coming from the committee has no legal effect. It's symbolic. It's more ceremonial. It makes a political statement, not a legal one. However, and in fact, if you're with the Department of Justice, it may complicate their job even more, because one of the claims will be, if they move forward with the charges, is that it's politically motivated. So the committee had one role. The Department of Justice has a very different role. It's independent, and that decision I expect to see in early 2023.
Keeping in mind the word politics throughout all of this. So is this a moment of truth for Trump, the Attorney General Merrick Garland, and the DOJ?
Bruce, this is going to be in 2023 a moment of truth for the Department of Justice, for Merrick Garland, for President Trump, but I'd suggest it's a moment of truth for the country. We'll actually be seeing something we've never seen before in 2023, and that is the possibility of a former president who's running for president against the person who appointed the Attorney General potentially being indicted for federal crimes. A very grave, very serious matter. It will test our political institutions. There are some who want to see this happen. There are some who are opposed to it, some who simply want to survive it. But make no mistake, it is a moment of truth, not only for them, but for the entire country, and I expect that early in 2023.
So you have a special investigator who is involved in all of this. The special investigator is part of the DOJ. Does this in some way leave Merrick Garland in the background and let the special prosecutor do his job?
You know, Bruce, context is important here. When Donald Trump announced that he was running back in November, I believe he did it in part to complicate this situation, to make it more difficult for the Department of Justice to bring those charges. 3 days later, Merrick Garland appointed Jack Smith as special counsel. That appointment really was an attempt to insulate the Department of Justice from the allegation that whatever happens will be political in nature. I also believe it shows that there's a very serious factual basis for what's going on, or else there wouldn't have been necessarily an appointment of a special counsel. In the future, as we move forward, you can expect Jack Smith to be at the front of this in terms of trying to insulate the department. But in the end, it's Merrick Garland, it's the Justice Department. And like I said, we'll find out whether those criminal charges will be filed.
So during the committee hearings, there was no cross-examination of witnesses. If this thing goes to trial, there is going to have to be evidence. So it's a whole different ballgame.
Bruce, it is an entirely different ballgame. What we saw with the committee was some very compelling testimony. And I believe part of their strength was also their weakness. These 9 members agreed on everything. They were building a case against Donald Trump, and oftentimes it was compelling. However, it was also a weakness. There was no cross-examination. There was no rebuttal. There was no presentation of the other side. Their audience was the public, the court of public opinion. It was not a jury. The Department of Justice has a very different standard. Indict or not indict. Crime or no crime. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt or not, and what's in the best interest of the country. 2 different standards. It'll be a very different decision for the Department of Justice than it was for this committee.
And the prosecution of a former president and current presidential candidate is so politically explosive. Timing is important here. If they are going to do this, they will have to have this wrapped up before the 2024 presidential election.
Bruce, you make a really good point. Typically, the Justice Department, and you look at U.S. attorneys' offices all around the country, they tend to operate very independently on their own timetable. But here, the political calendar is going to dictate to the Department of Justice they have to make some decisions. Looming, of course, as you mentioned, is the 2024 presidential election. But before that, in 2023, the presidential election is taking hold. If they're going to make their decision, they'll have to do it sooner rather than later, because in 2023, we will find out, is Joe Biden running? Is Ron DeSantis running? What about Donald Trump? What about others in the field? And before that takes off, the Department of Justice is going to have to make a decision one way or the other, because the political calendar is looming.
And if there is no legal proceeding here, is legacy and history almost as important?
I think the committee's work will be trying to leave a legacy and history of trying to have accountability, to trying to shine a spotlight on what took place. But like I mentioned earlier, their strength was the presentation. but also the weakness is that you didn't see the other side. But for the history books, their work yesterday was important, and they were making a statement as much for history as they were for the Department of Justice.
This may be a difficult question to answer. What do you think our founding fathers would think?
I think they might say that the constitutional framework that they set up more than 200 years ago in 1789 when we adopted the Constitution has withstood the test of time, that we've had the peaceful transfer of power, and that it withstood the test 2 years ago. They might also say, however, that that constitutional framework will be tested in 2023.
Food for thought for sure.
Yes, Bruce.
Rick, always a pleasure. Appreciate you being here.